What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this Bolens string trimmer, and the problem is I picked it off the curb for free and I don't know if it runs. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video we try and repair this trimmer, however it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. So I saw an ad for some free trimmers on Craigslist, and this is one of them. It's mostly intact except for a few screws, which isn't a big deal. Now this particular engine isn't my favorite design. The fuel tank is on top while the spark plug is at the bottom. Most conventional trimmers are the other way around with the spark plug on top. The biggest problem is if the fuel lines shrink, the tank will leak all the fuel out of it. Now that's something you don't have to worry about when the tank is at the bottom of the engine. The first thing I want to do is see if the engine still has compression. The easiest way is to slowly pull on the rope and feel how much the engine is fighting back. So the engine is fighting back quite a lot, so I'm pretty sure there's enough compression for it to run. Another thing I realized was that I was pulling the rope over was that the trimmer head was spinning. That means that there's no clutch on this engine, which is one way to reduce costs and of course the sale price. Now that I know there's plenty of compression, I want to put some fuel into the carburetor's throat and try starting it. This will also check to see if we have spark from the ignition system as well. Unfortunately, this means we have to remove the rear cover to get to the carburetor. Now there's usually 4 screws that hold the cover on, but some of them are missing. Fortunately, it ran, and for a lot longer than I was expecting it to. Now, since it ran better than expected, I want to see if I can replace the primer bulb, put some fuel in the tank, and try starting it. Now, after taking the fuel cap off, I found out the fuel line isn't seated in the tank like it's supposed to. There's not supposed to be this much fuel line in the tank. The filter is supposed to be sticking up where the fuel line is coming into the tank instead. I'll start by removing the fuel lines and the primer bulb. Now, I might have to replace any of the lines I can't reuse for this test. So here's the new primer bulb. You can find these online or at your local hardware stores. As you can see, the 2 ports on the back are not the same length. The longer port connects to the line that goes to the fuel tank, while the shorter line goes to the top of the carburetor. Now the line that goes to the carburetor isn't going to stay on, so I'll replace that line with some new Tygon line. The line measures in at only 3/16 of an inch. Now I'm not going to run the lines through the plastic housing just yet because I'm still testing if it's worth fixing. Also, I will not be removing the original return line, so to keep fuel from leaking everywhere, I'll just plug it. After putting fuel in the tank and making sure there aren't any leaks, I'll start pressing the primer bulb. What I want to see is fuel coming out of the new bit of line and into the bulb. After that, it should spray out of the longer port. If it does, then I'll try starting it, and if it starts, I'll just replace the lines and be done. If it doesn't start, then I'll have to remove the carburetor and inspect it for any problems. So unfortunately it didn't start, but it might be flooded now. I'll try starting it again, but this time I'll put the choke in the run position. Well, it looks like we're going to have to inspect the carburetor for problems now. I'll pour out the fuel and then remove the 2 bolts holding the carburetor to the engine. After removing the pumping side of the carburetor, we can now see the internal screen. We need to make sure that it's clean and that fuel can flow through it. Now it does have some debris on the screen, but it's not that bad. If yours is covered with debris, then check to make sure that the fuel filter isn't missing from the fuel tank. We also need to make sure that these 2 check valve flaps are flat and parallel with the rest of the diaphragm. The easiest way is to look at it from the side. Now this one is fine, so I'll reuse it. If yours isn't, then you might want to consider buying a rebuild kit or replacement carburetor. After that, I'll remove the plate over the metering diaphragm and inspect it for any signs of hardening or wrinkles. The plate is usually a little stuck, but this has to be the worst I've ever seen. And unfortunately, the metering diaphragm is completely petrified, so we'll have to replace it. To replace it, just peel it off from its gasket, and it looks like it's not going to come off without a fight. Only the outer edge came off, so I'll just have to stab a flathead into the diaphragm and remove it. We need to remove the needle and rocker arm assembly because we need to try and remove this old varnish. Just be very careful because the parts are small and easy to lose, especially the spring. You may have to use a wire brush if the varnish is tough to remove. Now when spraying the screen, make sure that the carburetor cleaner passes through the screen. We'll also test that fuel will pass through it later on. Unfortunately, it's not flowing like I want it to through the screen, so I'll lightly scratch the screen with a small flathead screwdriver. Just be very careful you don't use a lot of force. Just agitate it till the cleaner disappears through the screen. Then we can put some fuel in the screen pocket to make sure it does the same thing. After putting some fuel into the screen pocket, it did disappear. It just took a little bit longer than I want. Now I'm sure when fresh fuel gets to it, it'll start flowing a little bit better. Now after cleaning the metering side of the carburetor, I'll replace the metering diaphragm, and this is how flexible it's supposed to be. Then I'll put the rest of the carburetor back together again. Another reason why this trimmer might not be starting is that the engine is just worn out. The main part that wears out is the piston ring. Now to confirm this situation, try using a compression tester. The number you should get is over 100 psi, and the higher the better. If your compression is under 100 psi, you could try replacing the piston ring to give you another season or two. Now the piston ring isn't really that expensive. The last one I bought was only $5 and it took me about an hour to replace, so in the long run it could save you a lot of money. The last thing we need to do is remove the old fuel lines and replace it with some yellow tie gun line. The biggest pain about this engine is the fuel line routing and the possibility of fuel leaks. Now this black line didn't seem to last very long. It seems to get really soft and the outer casing seems to just slough off. Now this is not the original fuel line that came from the factory, so the previous owner must have replaced the line. I think I can reuse this fuel filter, so I'll blow some carburetor cleaner through the line and use some compressed air to force it out. Not that it's necessary, but I want to clean some of this old gas from the side of the fuel tank. I'll spray it down with some carburetor cleaner and then use a wire brush to help break it up. The first line I'm going to be running is the filter line. Now I originally tried to use 3/16 of an inch line, but later on I switched to smaller 140 thousandths of an inch instead, and I added a splice just in case I need to go back to the larger line. I used a smaller diameter line because it allowed the filter stem to pass through the tank, whereas the thicker line was almost impossible. Now after the filter is on the line, pull the line so the filter is near the bottom of the tank, then I'll use my bent long nose pliers to push it through the tank. Now the plastic washer that's normally at the bottom of the tank is gone, so I won't be replacing that. After cutting the line, I'll use the splice to reconnect the line that will go to the bottom of the carburetor after passing it through a small hole in the black plastic. Now, I'll connect all the fuel lines later on when I have them cut. Next, I'll make the return line that goes into the tank, and I'll use the larger 3/16 of an inch line for this one. I usually push about half an inch to 1 inch into the tank, but you can push more if you want. Now, this line will connect to the longer port on the back of the primer bulb, so I'll run it through the large opening where the bulb will sit. The last line I'll be cutting will go from the primer bulb to the top of the carburetor. I'll run the line back through the primer bulb area and then pass it back through a small hole in the black plastic back to where the carburetor will be. Now that we have all the fuel lines ran and cut, I should have 4 fuel line ends visible. I'll start by connecting the last line we just cut. The end that goes out to the primer bulb area will go to the shorter port on the primer bulb. The other fuel line that comes from the fuel tank in the primer bulb area goes to the longer port. After connecting the lines, I can then seat the primer bulb in its mount. The next line I'll connect is the line that comes from the shorter port of the primer bulb. Now this line will go to the top port on the carburetor, and of course that leaves us with one last line to connect, which is the fuel filter line from the tank. Now this line will connect to the bottom port on the carburetor. After connecting the throttle cable to the carb, I can now reinstall it back on the engine, put some fuel in the tank, and then try priming the fuel system. So the fuel should flow from the smaller fuel filter line through the black plastic housing and into the bottom port of the carburetor. Then it should come out of the top port of the carburetor and back through the black plastic housing and into the shorter port on the back of the primer bulb. The fuel should fill up the bulb and then out of the longer port on the back of the primer bulb and back to the tank. So it looks like it's flowing just like it's supposed to. Now I'll try starting it. So it didn't start, but it could now be flooded. I'll try starting it again, but this time I'll move the choke lever to the run position. So it was definitely flooded, but at least it started and ran for a little bit. Now before I try tuning the carburetor, I want to try starting it one more time. I want to see if it runs differently from the first time, and the more information I have about how it runs, it'll give me a better idea how I need to tune the carburetor. So it started and ran about the same, and I think it needs more fuel. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to make any adjustments. While I was trying to find the right carburetor adjustment tool, it started leaking fuel, and making any adjustments isn't going to fix this leak. And after a few minutes of this, it got even worse, so it's not worth the risk of a fire to even bother tuning it. The good part is that I know this trimmer will run, so I know it's worth replacing the carburetor. I would usually just order a new one, but I happen to have another trimmer with the exact same engine and carb, so I decided to swap them just to make sure it does run. If it does, I'll order a new one. Now, aside from a kill switch that seems to only work if you really press on it, I say the engine is running just fine. If you noticed when I was trying to start it, I went from choke to the run position. I was pretty sure the engine was still flooded from the last time when the carburetor was leaking. Now remember, I was just trying to prove that this engine runs fine with a swapped carburetor. I didn't even bother tuning it since I know it's not meant for this engine. I'll order a new carburetor, tune it for this particular engine, and it should be ready to use for this next mowing season. So how much money did I spend, and how much time did it take to make this repair? Well, the fuel line was about $2 a foot, and in the end I used about 2 feet, so the fuel line was about $4. Now the swapped carburetor from the other trimmer only needed a metering diaphragm, and a pack of 30 was $15, and I used one, so it was only 50 cents. Now the primer bulb was a pack of 5 for $5, so it was only $1. So in total, it was $5.50 to repair this trimmer, and the repair work took about 2 hours, and in my book, that's a very affordable repair versus buying a new trimmer. However, I will be replacing this carburetor with a new kit that includes a primer bulb, so taking that in consideration, I really should take away 50 cents for the diaphragm and $1 for the primer bulb, as I'll just add it back into stock. The price of the kit is $10.50 after shipping, so the eventual cost will be $14.50, and in my opinion, that's still a great price to pay. So my question is, do you think it was worth fixing this trimmer, or should I have just bought a brand new trimmer instead? Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.